The mud sucked at his boots like it didn't want him to leave. Eli Sanborn knelt at the edge of Clabber Creek, Pushmataha County, Oklahoma, fingers combing through silt for cold iron. Rain needled the back of his neck. Somewhere behind him, a rooster complained about the hour. He found it, a horseshoe, snapped clean through, rust blooming like a wound. He turned it over twice, thumbed a faint mark stamped into the heel, and slid it into a burlap sack already heavy with 499 others. By sunup he'd laid them all out across the barn floor in rows so straight you'd think a surveyor did it. Each shoe faced the same direction. Each one cracked, bent, or split at the toe. His grandfather Odell stood in the doorway, coffee steaming, watching the boy crouch over broken iron like a man reading scripture. Neighbors driving past slowed their trucks to stare. Nobody asked why a 17-year-old had spent 3 years gathering junk nobody else wanted. What they didn't know was that Eli wasn't collecting horseshoes at all. He was collecting a name. If you're new here, welcome to the porch. I tell stories about folks the world wrote off too early, the ones ridiculed for holding onto something everybody else had thrown away. Hit that subscribe button if that sounds like your kind of evening, and drop a comment telling me what town or state you're listening from tonight. Some of you are driving. Some of you are falling asleep to this. Either way, I'm glad you're here for what's coming. Pushmataha County didn't hand out second chances easy. The Sanborn place sat 6 miles outside Clabber Creek on 80 acres of red dirt pasture, half of it gone to Broomstead, since the vet Bills ate the herd down to 9 horses, and a mule too stubborn to sell. Odell Sanborn had shod half the county once, hands like tanned leather, back bent from 40 years over the anvil, until a stroke folded his right side inward and left the forge cold. His son, Eli's father, had died in a combine accident when Eli was 9. What remained was a widow named Delpha Sanborn, a grandfather who couldn't lift a hammer anymore, and a boy who noticed everything. Delpha kept a coffee can on the kitchen windowsill where the tax notices went, unopened, stacked like kindling nobody wanted to burn. She'd read the first one aloud once, at supper, then never again. The Pushmataha County Assessor's Office had scheduled the property for tax auction in 30 days, March the 14th, Block 62, Parcel 4, unless the back balance was paid in full. Delpha ironed Eli's church shirt every Sunday like the house wasn't slipping out from under them, because some routines are the only floor a family has left to stand on. Word of the boy's shoe pile reached town the way most things did in Clabber Creek over the counter at Cobb's Feed and Seed. Garland Cobb, Delpha's brother, ran the register and most opinions in a 50-mile radius. Boys got 500 busted horseshoes stacked in that barn, he told a farmer buying salt blocks, shaking his head. Same barn his granddaddy's about to lose. You'd think he'd collect something worth a nickel. Thora Beeman, who ran the church flower fund, said it kinder but not by much. Bless his heart, he does love his little hobby. Nobody used the word foolish. They didn't need to. Their faces did it for them. Well, he didn't answer the talk. He answered the shoes. Each evening after chores he sat cross-legged in lantern light with a wire brush, a rag, and a magnifying glass his grandfather kept for reading seed catalogs. He scrubbed rust from the heel of every shoe, hunting for stamps, tiny letters and figures pressed into iron by whatever hand had forged it. Some bore a crescent, some a simple X, but one mark kept surfacing, again and again, on shoes pulled from creek beds, fence lines, and the collapsed foundation of the old cavalry remount station 11 miles south. 2 capital letters, worn thin but unmistakably the same every time. J and V. JV, Eli said one night, sliding the shoe across the kitchen table toward Odell. His grandfather's good hand trembled as he lifted it to the lamp. Something shifted behind the old man's eyes, recognition, maybe, or memory trying to surface through scar tissue. Jeremiah Voss, Odell finally rasped, the first full sentence he'd managed in a week. Farrier before my time, shod for the army out of Fort Towson. Men used to say his shoes never threw, never cracked. Folks kept them for luck long after the horse was gone. Eli's pulse quickened. 41 shoes in his pile bore that same worn stamp. He wrote to 3 museums that week: the State Historical Society, a cavalry preservation group out of Texas, a blacksmithing guild he found in an old farrier's journal at the library. 2 never answered. 1 sent a form letter thanking him for his interest. Garland Cobb heard about the letters before Eli even got them mailed because the postmistress liked to talk. Writing to museums now, Garland laughed to a table of men drinking coffee at the feed store. About horseshoes, Lord have mercy. That family's losing the farm and the boys playing historian. Eli heard it secondhand from Thora, who told him gently, the way you'd tell a child the dog had died. Then the rain came, and it didn't stop. 4 days of it, hard and gray, swelling Clabber Creek over its banks and into the low pasture where Eli had built a lean-to shed to store the overflow of shoes he couldn't fit in the barn. He woke on the 5th morning to find the shed gone, walls, roof, and near 200 shoes swept downstream in the muddy current, scattered across a half-mile of bottomland and buried in silt. He stood in the wreckage in his socks, rain still falling, and didn't say a word. Delpha found him there an hour later, unmoving, the coffee can of tax notices heavier on her mind than ever. Maybe it's a sign, Garland said that afternoon, not unkindly, just tired of watching his sister struggle. Maybe it's time to let this go and put your energy someplace it'll do some good. Eli didn't answer him. He walked out into the wet pasture instead, boots sinking, and began pulling shoes out of the mud one at a time, rinsing each in creek water, laying them on a feed sack to dry. Odell watched from the porch, unable to help with his body, so he did the only thing left to him. He sat in the rain until Delpha made him come inside, so the boy wouldn't be alone out there. By dusk, Eli had recovered 160 of the lost shoes. 40 were gone for good, swallowed by the creek. He sat on the porch steps that night with mud dried to his elbows, and Delpha brought him a plate he didn't touch. I know how it looks, he told her. I know what everybody thinks. She sat beside him, quiet a long moment. Your grandfather thought that iron sang before it ever left the forge, she said. Said a man could hear the maker in it, if he knew how to listen. Eli looked down at the shoe in his lap, the stamp worn soft as an old coin. He decided, right there, not to stop. With 18 days left before the auction date, Eli mailed 1 more letter, not to a museum this time, but to a name he'd found in Odell's old farrier journal, tucked in a margin note from decades back. Silas Kettering, master blacksmith, last known trade address in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The journal claimed Kettering had once apprenticed under a man who'd apprenticed under Jeremiah Voss himself. Eli didn't know if the address still held. He didn't know if the letter would even arrive in time. He sent it anyway, walked to the mailbox in the cold, and stood there a moment like a man dropping a coin down a well, listening for a splash that might never come. 9 days before the auction, a truck Eli didn't recognize rattled up the drive, dented, dust-caked, hauling a trailer stacked with anvils, tongs, and coiled iron stock. A broad-shouldered man climbed down, silver-bearded, forearms scarred pale from decades of sparks. I'm looking for the boy who wrote me about the Voss stamp, he said, before he'd even introduced himself. Garland, who'd come to gloat over another failed scheme, stood frozen by his truck. Eli's hands shook as he led the stranger to the barn. Delpha followed, wiping flour from her apron. Odell, watching from the porch, straightened his back for the first time in a year. Silas Kettering didn't say much at first. He knelt over the rows of shoes the way a man kneels at a grave he's traveled far to visit. He turned each stamped piece slowly in the barn light, running a thumb over the worn letters, and set aside every shoe bearing the JV mark into its own careful pile. 41 shoes. He counted them twice. Then he pulled a small hammer from his coat and, without a word of explanation, struck the heel of 1 shoe against the anvil edge. The sound rang clean and high, a bell note that hung in the barn air far longer than iron should allow. Kettering struck a 2nd shoe, a 3rd. Each one sang the same true note, the mark, he'd later explain, of iron folded and hammered by a farrier who never once cut a corner, whose horses never threw a shoe in 100 miles of hard road. Garland stood in the doorway, coffee forgotten in his hand, listening to iron ring like a struck church bell over and over across that barn floor. By the next morning, half of Clabber Creek had heard the ringing and come to see for themselves. Trucks lined the drive that hadn't come up it in years. Thora Beeman stood at the fence with her hand over her mouth. Farmers who'd laughed at the boy now stood silent, watching Kettering hold up shoe after shoe stamped with the same worn letters, explaining to anyone who'd listened that the Fort Towson Cavalry Museum had spent 11 years searching for a verified Voss collection to complete their restored remount forge display. And here it sat, in a falling-down barn, cleaned and catalogued by a boy nobody had taken seriously. The museum's offer came by phone 2 days later, Kettering serving as go-between, and it was enough for the back taxes, enough to spare, enough that Delpha sat down hard in her kitchen chair and didn't get up for a long while. On auction day, March the 14th, the courthouse steps in Clabber Creek stood empty of any Sanborn business at all. Garland Cobb drove out that same afternoon, hat in his hands, and stood at the barn door a long while before he could get the words out. Eli just handed him a shoe to hold, and let the iron do the talking he couldn't quite manage himself. The Fort Towson Cavalry Museum installed its Voss collection that autumn, 41 shoes mounted behind glass, a small brass plate crediting E. Sanborn, Clabber Creek, Oklahoma for their recovery. Odell asked to be driven to see it once and stood a long while at the case, tracing the shape of letters he'd once forged himself, back when his hands still could. Eli still walks the creek bank some mornings, though he doesn't need to anymore. Folks in town greet him differently now, not with laughter, but with the particular respect reserved for someone who was right the whole time and never once said so. Some silences, it turns out, ring truer than any hammer,